This is our final in our initial series of videos on proper alignment for the basic poses in the Sun Salutation, the poses that you'll see over and over in your vinyasa class, and the poses that are most vulnerable, leave you most vulnerable for injury. And the one pose, the daddy of all of the yoga poses that you will practice over and over again in your yoga class, is your downward facing dog. And downward facing dog can really wreak havoc on your shoulders if you don't do it properly. So Lauren is going to come into a downward facing dog. First she'll come into a plank pose so that we make sure that the distance between her hands and feet in downward facing dog is appropriate for her body. Good, then go ahead and using your core lift into your downward facing dog. So starting at her hands, the index finger knuckle and thumb knuckle are pressing strongly into the mat so that she's not rolling onto the outside edge of her fingers. And the wrist creases are in line with the front of her mat. Her biceps are rotating out to really make sure that those shoulders are on her back and that she's not hanging out in the shoulder joint. And the under part of her arms is really resisting the mat and pressing away. Her lower ribs, instead of jutting out, are pulled in nice and tight. Her abdominal muscles are engaged and her hips are in a neutral position. Thighs are pressing back into the hamstrings, and there's an external rotation from the inner thighs, towards the back. The legs are long and strong, and the heels are working their way towards the mat. Some of the common misalignments that we see in downward facing dog are the feet will be a little bit too wide, wider than hip distance apart, or more often than not, more narrow. So you want to just make sure that you bring your feet just about hips width distance apart. If the hamstrings are really tight, bend the knees, and don't worry so much about the heels reaching the mat. But when the hamstrings are tight, often what happens is the knees are bent and the back is rounded in order to get that stretch in the back. Also, many times the pelvis is pitched up to get that extra stretch in the hamstrings. You want to make sure that the pelvis is neutral. And you want to draw the lower ribs in so that you're not hanging out in the lower back and dumping into the lumbar spine. And the most common and the most difficult, the most challenging on your body is when the shoulder blades aren't secured on the back, but that you're dumping into your shoulder joint and really dropping down, creating stress on that joint. Arms are not, getting a little tired, Lauren, arms are not fully engaged, hanging down to the elbows. And many times when we work to take that external rotation of the biceps to get the shoulder blades back on the back, rather than doing it with the muscles, the student will take the hands out to the side. You want to make sure that those wrist creases are in line with the front of the mat. You can drop down onto your knees, Lauren. You did a great job. That's your Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog.